What is colder than extinction is survival that no longer looks pure. Across Europe, older languages vanished while new tongues spread through migrations, marriages, and generations. Yet in the Western Pyrenees, one voice remained outside the Indo-European family, carried by people whose DNA does not tell a simple story of untouched origins. If blood can change while a name, a land, and a language endure, what was really preserved and what was quietly lost? The Basque DNA Mystery were Europe's oldest people here before the Indo-Europeans. At the western edge of Europe, where the Pyrenees lower their stone shoulders toward the Atlantic, the land does not feel like a clean border. It feels more like a slow meeting place. Mountains fold into green valleys. Rivers move through narrow passages before reaching the sea. Rain darkens the hills, softens the fields, and leaves a shine on old paths that have been crossed for longer than any written record can follow. In such a place, history does not arrive as a single road. It arrives in layers, through passes, shorelines, family lines, trade, marriage, retreat, and return. The Basque country, spread across the Western Pyrenees and the Bay of Biscay, sits inside this layered edge. It is not outside Europe. It is not untouched by Europe. Yet it has long seemed to hold something that does not fit easily into the map of European origins. For a listener lying still at night, the mystery begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet attention. Most of Europe can be described through later movements that carried new languages, new ancestry, and new social worlds across the continent. But in this corner, a language survived that does not belong to the great Indo-European family surrounding it. That fact alone is enough to make the hills feel different. Not magical, not frozen, but different in the way an old doorway is different from a wall that was rebuilt many times. Human beginnings were never simple. Long before nations, before borders, before names like France or Spain, people moved through landscapes because bodies need water, shelter, food, and kin. The first human routes across Europe were not drawn on maps. They followed seasons, animal paths, coastlines, river valleys, and the limits of endurance. Every community began as a negotiation between the human body and the land beneath it. In the Western Pyrenees, that negotiation may have had a special kind of slowness. The mountains did not seal people away, but they shaped how contact happened. A valley could hold families close. A pass could open only certain ways through. The sea could bring strangers, yet also mark the end of the road. This is why the Basque question cannot be treated as a simple question of isolation. The land allowed contact, but it also slowed it, filtered it, and gave local life places to remain. When later peoples crossed Europe, when farmers spread, when herders moved, when empires built roads, this region did not stand apart like an island in myth. It received, changed, and answered in its own rhythm. That rhythm matters because DNA is not a museum label attached to a people forever. DNA changes through generations, through birth, survival, and marriage. A language changes too, but not in the same way. A child receives genes without choosing them, yet learns speech from the voices close enough to be heard every day. In a mountain valley, those two inheritances can move at different speeds. A family line may shift while a word remains. A word may disappear while ancestry stays. This is the cold center of the Basque DNA mystery. Survival does not always mean purity, and age does not always mean stillness. The human origin story hidden behind this landscape is not a story of one first people preserved like amber. It is a story of repeated beginnings. Each generation begins again with a newborn body, a local language, a remembered place, and a world already changed by those who came before. The Western Pyrenees ask us to slow down before making claims. They ask us to notice how a people can be ancient in one sense and transformed in another. They ask us to hold mountain stone, Atlantic rain, old speech, and DNA in the same thought. Only then can the title begin to open without becoming a false answer. What, in this place, is truly old? The first strange fact is simple enough to say, but difficult to hold without turning it into legend. Across almost all of Europe, the living languages belong to one enormous family. English, Spanish, French, German, Greek, Russian, Irish, Polish, and many others are distant relatives separated by time, borders, sound, and history, yet still connected through the Indo-European family. Their relationship is not always visible to the ear. A person listening casually would not hear French and Russian as cousins. Yet language scholars have shown that many of their deepest structures and older words point back towards shared ancestry. Europe, in that sense, became a continent of related voices. Then the Basque language appears like a quiet interruption. It is spoken in the Western Pyrenees, surrounded by Romance languages that grew from Latin, but it does not descend from Latin. It is not a Celtic language. It is not Germanic, Slavic, Greek, or Indo-Iranian. As far as widely accepted scholarship can say, it has no proven living relative. That does not mean it came from nowhere. No human language comes from nowhere. It means the relatives it may once have had are gone, changed beyond recognition, or not preserved in a way that allows careful proof. For a sleep story about human origins, this is more powerful than any invented secret. It tells us that the past can disappear without leaving silence behind. Sometimes it leaves one living voice standing alone because the surrounding voices vanished. The Basque mystery begins here, not as a claim that one people remained unchanged, but as evidence that Europe once contained more linguistic diversity than it does now. Before the spread of Indo-European languages, the continent was not mute. Families taught children how to name water, stone, mother, fire, hunger, danger, and home. Those words were carried in breath, not carved into durable records. Most of them were eventually replaced, not necessarily through one violent moment, but through generations of contact, advantage, prestige, settlement, and survival. A language can fade when children stop learning it at home. It can shrink when trade, law, religion, or marriage favours another tongue. It can vanish from a valley without leaving more than place names, fragments, or nothing at all. Against that wider loss, Basque becomes a question shaped like a survivor. Why did this voice remain when so many others did not? The answer cannot be reduced to the blood of the people who speak it. DNA and language travel together sometimes, but not always. A population can adopt a new language from neighbours, rulers, spouses, or children. Another population can keep an older language while its ancestry becomes mixed through ordinary human life. This is why the title must be approached carefully. Europe's oldest people cannot mean a sealed biological line from the deep past. It can only point toward a more delicate idea, a community whose language preserves a connection to a pre-Indo-European Europe, while its people, like all people, carry ancestry shaped by many generations. Human beginnings are like that. They are not pure lines drawn from one origin to one present. They are braided paths. A child born in any ancient valley received a body from parents, speech from caregivers, food from the land, and habits from a community already older than memory. In the Basque case, the braid is unusually visible because one thread, the language, did not merge into the larger Indo-European pattern. The body may record mixture, the land may record movement, the tongue may record continuity. None of these records is complete alone. Together, they create a mystery that is colder and quieter than myth. Not how a people avoided history, but how one voice remained audible after Europe changed around it. For that reason, the question must stay open, patient, and close to the ground. Where ordinary families once carried names through weather, work, birth, and slow time, the deeper question is not whether the Basque people are simply the oldest people in Europe, as if a human community could pass through thousands of years without changing. That idea sounds clear, but the real past is less clean and more human. What is old can mean many different things. A language can be old because it belongs to no surviving family around it. A place can be old because families have remained attached to its valleys, hills, and coast for many generations. A genetic pattern can be old because it preserves traces of earlier populations, even after later mixing. A memory can be old because people keep speaking names that began before written history entered the region. These forms of age do not always match one another. They can overlap, separate, disappear, or return in altered forms. This is why the Basque mystery asks for patience. If we ask only about blood, we risk missing the voice. If we ask only about language, we risk imagining bodies that never changed. If we ask only about land, we may forget that every landscape has been crossed by travellers, neighbours, traders, spouses, children, soldiers, farmers, and strangers. The human beginning is never one object. It is a relationship between body, speech, food, shelter, birth, death, and place. In the Western Pyrenees, those relationships seem to have arranged themselves in a rare way. The language remained outside the Indo-European family. The population carried ancestry shaped by ancient Iberia and by wider European changes. The land gave continuity without creating complete separation. The result is not a simple fossil of prehistory. It is closer to a living shoreline, where each tide leaves something behind and takes something away. For many older stories about Europe, people looked for pure origins. They wanted one first people, one first tongue, one clean inheritance. Modern evidence makes that harder to believe. Ancient DNA has shown that Europe was shaped by repeated movements. Hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age, farming communities spreading from the southeast, pastoral groups moving across wide grasslands, and many local histories that cannot be reduced to one map. The Basque case does not cancel those movements. It sits inside them. Its importance comes from the way one linguistic thread remained visible, while so many nearby threads were replaced or absorbed. To understand that, we have to think in generations. Imagine not a dramatic invasion scene, but a long chain of households. In each household, the child learns the first words from people close by. The child also carries ancestry from parents and grandparents, including ancestors who may have come from elsewhere. Over many generations, speech and DNA can move together for a while, then drift apart. A village may marry into neighboring communities and still keep its everyday language. Another village may keep many local ancestors but slowly shift to the speech of a larger power. Nothing in this process needs to be sudden. Much of human history changes at the speed of bedtime voices, market conversations, work in fields, and names spoken over sleeping children. Even before writing, this was how human beginnings continued. Not as one frozen origin, but as daily repetition inside vulnerable bodies. Breath carried words, hands shared food, feet crossed the same wet ground until paths became memory. This is why the question at the start of the journey must remain carefully balanced. The Basque people are not valuable because they are imagined as unchanged. They are valuable because their history helps us see how change and continuity can live in the same body of people. Their DNA asks one kind of question, their language asks another. Their mountains and coast ask a third. Together, they do not give us a final answer yet. They give us a better way to listen to Europe before the Indo-European world became dominant, and to ask what can survive when almost everything around it has learned a different name. Before the Indo-European languages covered most of Europe, the continent was not waiting in silence. It was already filled with people who had names for rivers, tools, kin, weather, animals, grief, food, and sleep. Those names were not all related to one another. They did not belong to one single ancient voice. Europe was a wide human landscape, shaped by many communities whose languages were spoken in valleys, forests, coastlands, islands, plains, and mountain shelters. Most of those languages left little or no direct trace. Some may have survived only in place names. Some may have disappeared so completely that no careful scholar can rebuild their sound. This is one of the quiet losses behind European history. Long before written kingdoms, long before Rome, long before medieval borders, people were speaking worlds that have now vanished from the mouth of every living child. The Basque language matters because it reminds us of that lost variety. It does not prove that one untouched population carried one unchanged culture from the beginning. It shows something more modest. Europe once had many voices outside the family that later became dominant, and almost all of them are gone. To understand this, it helps to begin with the human body rather than with maps. A newborn does not inherit a language through blood. A newborn learns language from breath nearby, from repeated sounds, from hands pointing to water, fire, bread, danger, mother, father, stone, sky. Every language begins again inside the vulnerability of a child. That is why languages can vanish without bodies vanishing. If a generation speaks one tongue to its children, the voice continues. If the next generation chooses or is pressured to speak another, the older voice begins to fade. Across ancient Europe, this may have happened many times, without leaving a dramatic scar in the ground. A language can be replaced through settlement, trade, marriage, political power, religious prestige, or the slow, practical need to speak with neighbours. The people remain human, alive, related, mixed, adapting, but the old words may stop crossing from parent to child. In that sense, the pre-Indo-European world was not erased in one moment. It was thinned over generations. Its voices were absorbed, pushed aside, forgotten, or transformed. The difficulty is that speech is soft evidence. Stone tools can survive, bones can survive, pottery can survive in broken pieces, DNA can survive under rare conditions in ancient remains. But words die quickly when nobody repeats them. For most of prehistory, there was no writing to hold them still. A whole language could vanish from a valley and leave behind only the shape of a hill name, or not even that. This makes the Basque survival feel important, but it should also make us careful. A surviving language is not a window that shows the whole prehistoric room. It is one lit corner. It tells us that the room existed, and that it was larger than the languages Europe mostly speaks today. The origin of people in Europe was never only a matter of who arrived first. It was also a matter of who taught the next child to speak. Hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age, early farming communities, later herding groups, coastal traders, mountain villagers, and many unnamed families all contributed to the continent's fabric. Their descendants did not carry tidy labels. They carried bodies shaped by ancestry and habits shaped by daily life. The Basque case stands at the edge of this larger truth. It asks us to imagine a Europe where many languages once stood, where Spanish, French, English, German, and other Indo-European tongues now stand. It asks us to hear absence without filling it with fantasy. The old voices are not fully recoverable, but their disappearance gives the remaining voice its weight. Basque is not a complete answer to Europe before the Indo-Europeans. It is a reminder that the answer was once deeply plural. The spread of Indo-European languages across Europe should not be imagined as one wave breaking over an empty shore. It was more like many changes moving at different speeds through different landscapes. Some changes may have come with people migrating from far away. Some came through neighbours living side by side. Some came through marriage, trade, herding, farming, war, alliance, and the quiet pressure of useful speech. A language family can grow powerful without every village changing in the same way. It can enter first through chiefs, traders, warriors, priests, or families with wider connections. It can become useful in markets, in fields, on roads, or in households where people from different backgrounds must speak to one another. Then, slowly, children may begin to learn the newer language first, while the older one remains only in the mouths of grandparents. Over time, the change can look complete, even if no single moment ever completed it. This matters for the Basque question because Indo-European expansion was not simply a replacement of bodies. Ancient DNA has shown that Europe was shaped by major population movements, especially in the deep past, but language does not move exactly like bone or blood. Sometimes ancestry and language travel together, sometimes they separate. Community may receive new ancestors through ordinary family life, while keeping its own speech. Another may keep much local ancestry while changing language because another tongue brings power, safety, marriage, trade, or belonging. The human origin story is always partly biological and partly social. A baby is born from bodies, but becomes a member of a people through care, speech, food, rhythm, and remembered place. That is why the rise of Indo-European Europe cannot be reduced to one simple cause. Farming had already transformed much of the continent before many Indo-European languages became dominant. Herding and mobility later connected wide territories in new ways. Bronze and iron technologies changed travel, exchange, and conflict. Larger social networks gave some languages greater reach. Yet none of this erased every older voice at once. In some regions, older languages survived for centuries before fading. In others, they may have merged with incoming speech, leaving faint traces in place names or local words. In the Western Pyrenees, something different happened. Basque did not spread across Europe, but it also did not vanish. It endured in a region touched by many of the same forces that changed the rest of the continent. This makes its survival more interesting than a fantasy of isolation. If the land had been completely sealed, the story would be simpler but less human. The real pattern is harder and quieter. Contact occurred, ancestry changed, wider powers arrived, yet the daily chain of speech was not broken in the same way. To hear this clearly, we need to imagine history not as arrows on a map, but as generations at home. A mother speaks while grinding grain. A father calls across a slope. Children repeat the words they hear before they understand where those words came from. A neighbour marries in from another valley. A trader brings another language. A ruler's tongue becomes useful outside the village. Still, inside the house, the old speech may remain if enough children keep receiving it. This is how the beginning of a people can continue without staying pure. Each generation is both inheritance and interruption. The Indo-European world grew because many communities found reasons, pressures, or necessities to adopt related languages. The Basque-speaking world survived because, in one corner of Europe, the transfer from elder to child continued across changes that elsewhere often broke it. That does not make Basque untouched. It makes Basque a witness to the uneven speed of human history, where some things cross mountains quickly and other things remain in the valley until almost every surrounding name has changed. It is a of beginnings make, not a denial of movement itself. Basque enters the story not as a relic kept behind glass, but as a living language spoken by real communities in a real corner of Europe. Its importance comes from its position. Around it, the languages of Spain and France belong to the Indo-European family, shaped in large part by Latin and by later regional histories. Basque stands beside them, touches them, borrows from them, lives with them, and yet does not descend from them. That makes it unusual but not supernatural. It is not proof that the people who speak it have remained biologically unchanged since some distant beginning. It is not proof that a single ancient tribe survived untouched while all others disappeared. It is better understood as a rare survival of a language line that did not get absorbed into the dominant linguistic pattern of Europe. This distinction is important because human history often tempts us to confuse language with blood. A person may speak the language of ancestors who lived nearby for a long time, but that person's DNA may also include ancestry from many contacts, marriages, and migrations. Another person may have deep local ancestry yet speak a language brought by later powers. The mouth and the genome do not always keep the same calendar. In the Basque case, the language points toward a Europe before Indo-European dominance, while the DNA points toward a population history shaped by the same broad processes that shaped other Europeans, though in its own regional way. That is why Basque belongs in this story carefully. It is a witness, not a complete archive. It tells us that one pre-Indo-European voice survived into the present, but it does not allow us to hear all the lost voices that once surrounded it. For the human beginning behind this question, the image should not be a line of pure descent. It should be a household. A child is born with ancestry from parents, grandparents, and people farther back than memory. But that same child learns identity from daily closeness. The sound used for water, the name of a hill, the warning given near a cliff, the words spoken before sleep. If the same kind of speech passes from adult to child again and again, the language survives, even while bodies continue to mix with neighbouring lives. This may be one reason Basque feels so powerful as a question. It shows that continuity can be carried by practice, not only by descent. A community can remain itself in one layer while changing in another. It can keep a language while receiving new ancestry. It can live in contact with wider worlds without becoming identical to them. Such a pattern is not strange when viewed through ordinary human life. It is only strange when viewed through simplified stories of origins. The Western Pyrenees did not preserve a frozen beginning. Instead, they seem to have helped preserve a chain of transmission, a habit of speaking, naming, and belonging that lasted while other nearby language lines disappeared. In that sense, Basque is not outside European history. It is one of the clearest reminders that European history was once broader than the languages that now dominate it. The mystery is not that a people escaped time. The mystery is that time moved through them unevenly. Some things changed with every generation. Some things were replaced, some things were added, and one language, altered like every living language, still remains separate enough to remind us that before Indo-European Europe, there were human worlds whose names have mostly fallen silent. The Basque question, therefore, begins with humility. It asks us to place one surviving voice at the edge of a much larger loss, and to listen without pretending that one voice can speak for them all. The land itself must be listened to before the people can be understood. In the Western Pyrenees, the ground rises and falls in close folds, not in one vast wall, but in a broken sequence of ridges, valleys, slopes, pastures, wooded hills, and river corridors. The Atlantic is never only a distant edge. Moist air moves inland from the Bay of Biscay, feeding green fields and clouded mountains, while narrow roads and older footpaths follow the easiest openings through the stone. This is not the kind of landscape that prevents movement completely. People have always crossed mountains when hunger, marriage, trade, danger, or curiosity gave them reason. But it is the kind of landscape that makes movement selective. A wide plain can pull distant groups into broad contact. A mountain valley can hold daily life in a smaller circle. Between those two conditions, history slows, turns, and gathers texture. For the Basque question, that matters deeply. A language does not survive in the air. It survives in mouths, houses, paths, villages, work, and childhood. A child does not learn the language of a continent. A child learns the language of the people close enough to speak during meals, labour, weather, and sleep. In a valley, closeness has shape. The slope, the river, the pass, and the season decide who is near, who is far, and how often outsiders become familiar. Human beginnings were always formed under conditions like these. Before writing, before states, before organised borders, bodies had to adapt to real ground. People needed water that could be reached, food that could be gathered or grown, shelters that could be maintained, and paths that did not waste too much strength. The Western Pyrenees do not give us a frozen image of the first Basque speakers, and they should not be used to invent one. What they give us is a reasonable setting for continuity, without complete isolation. The sea opened the region outward. The mountains gave it local depth. Valleys could keep family networks dense enough for language to pass steadily from one generation to the next, yet the same valleys could also receive newcomers, spouses, goods, tools, and ideas. This is why the word isolated must be used carefully. It can mislead if it suggests a sealed people untouched by time. The better image is a filter. The land did not stop history. It filtered history through terrain. Contact arrived, but not always with the same force or speed found in easier corridors. Influence entered, but it had to pass through existing households, local loyalties, and the everyday need to keep speaking to one's own children. In such a place, DNA and language might take different paths. A new person marrying into a village could change ancestry in the next generation, but the child of that marriage might still learn the local speech. A trader might bring foreign words, but not replace the language of the hearth. A political power might control roads or taxes, while the old voice continued in fields and kitchens beyond the reach of official speech. None of this requires a romantic image of mountain purity. It only requires ordinary human behavior repeated for a long time. The body moves through kinship. The voice moves through care. The land shapes both by deciding how often people meet, how far they travel, and where they return at night. This is the calm force of geography in the Basque DNA mystery. It does not answer the whole question, but it changes the way the question must be asked. If Europe before the Indo-Europeans held many lost languages, then survival may have depended not only on age, but on where a community lived, how its children were raised, how marriage networks formed, and how strongly daily speech remained tied to local belonging. The Western Pyrenees were not outside the human story. They were one of the places where the human story moved more unevenly. That unevenness may be the quiet reason why, long after many older European voices disappeared, one language at the Atlantic edge could still be heard. A mountain landscape can slow a language down without locking it away from the world. If a valley is hard to reach, fewer strangers pass through it by accident. If the road into it is narrow, contact arrives in smaller numbers, through known paths, at the pace of weather and season. But difficulty is not absence. People have crossed rough ground for as long as human bodies have needed food, partners, shelter, and safety. The Western Pyrenees could make movement slower and more local, yet they could never make human life motionless. The same ridges that held communities close also contained passes. The same coast that marked an edge also opened toward fishing, travel, and exchange. In this kind of place, culture can remain dense without becoming pure. A family may know the same hills for generations, but a marriage from another valley can bring new ancestry into the house. A village may keep its own speech, but borrow words for tools, crops, animals, law, or trade. A community may remain recognizable to itself, not because nothing changes, but because change is absorbed through local habits. The origin of people is always shaped by that balance. Early humans began as bodies moving through landscapes, measuring distance with hunger, cold, fatigue, and the need to return to others. Every human group had to decide, without formal maps, where movement was worth the cost. Mountains make that cost visible. They ask the legs to work harder. They make winter more serious. They create pockets where daily life can become inward-looking, even when the wider world is not far away. For Basque history, this helps explain why geography may have supported continuity. It could keep speech communities close enough for children to hear the same language every day. It could reduce the speed at which outside languages replaced local ones. It could make belonging feel tied to valleys, farmsteads, pastures, and remembered roots. Yet the same geography also allowed gradual mixture, because humans rarely live forever inside one circle. Young people marry. Families move when land becomes scarce. Traders arrive with goods and stories. Soldiers pass through. Shepherds cross high ground. Coastal people meet others by sea. These movements do not need to be large to matter. Over many generations, small movements can change the ancestry of a population. They can add new genetic threads while leaving the language of childhood mostly intact. That is why the Basque DNA mystery must be handled with care. The land may explain relative continuity, but it does not support a claim of untouched descent. A mountain valley is not a time machine. It cannot preserve a people from biology, marriage, disease, conflict, or ordinary desire. What it can do is shape the rhythm of change. It can make replacement less complete. It can give local speech more chances to survive inside homes, especially when larger powers remain outside the intimate space of family life. In many regions of Europe, easier routes may have helped dominant languages spread more widely and quickly. On open plains, contact networks can broaden, and political or economic pressure can reach farther into daily life. In a broken mountain and coast landscape, the pressure may still come, but it meets more turns, more local loyalties, more places where old speech remains useful because everyone nearby still understands it. Human beginnings in Europe were also made of these unequal speeds. Some groups moved rapidly along coasts or rivers, others stayed longer in protected zones. Some mixed with newcomers quickly, others did so more slowly. The Western Pyrenees remind us that history is not only a timeline, it is also a terrain. DNA follows bodies through marriage and birth. Language follows breath through childhood and memory. Culture follows repeated action through meals, work, grief, and naming. Geography does not command these things like a ruler, but it bends them like water moving through stone. The Basque case may therefore be less about escape from history, and more about history arriving in softened, uneven ways, leaving enough room for one old voice to keep being taught beside the Atlantic rain. To understand why the Western Pyrenees matter, it is helpful to remember that human beings never began as ideas floating above the earth. They began as bodies in weather. They began with feet on difficult ground, lungs taking in cold air, hands carrying food, eyes watching slopes, rivers, clouds, animals, strangers, and children. Every human community, no matter how ancient, had to answer the same quiet questions before it could become a people. Where can water be found? Where can children sleep safely? Which path can be crossed in winter? Which valley has enough food? Which neighbours can be trusted? Which voices are close enough to become familiar? These questions are older than writing, older than states, older than the names by which Europe now understands itself. In the Basque country, the land made those questions especially local. A mountain does not simply stand behind history as scenery. It changes the scale of daily life. A sea does not simply mark an edge. It gives roots, weather, food, and danger. Between mountain and ocean, people learn distance differently. They may know nearby valleys with great intimacy while remaining only partly connected to wider plains beyond the passes. This kind of life can create strong local rhythms. The rhythm of work follows slope and season. The rhythm of movement follows paths that can be crossed without wasting too much strength. The rhythm of speech follows the people who gather at night and rise again in the morning. If a language survives there, it does not survive because the land speaks for it. It survives because human mouths keep using it inside the patterns the land allows. The Basque mystery becomes clearer when seen through this slower connection between body and place. A language is passed on through closeness. Children hear what is repeated around them. They learn the words used for rain, bread, sheep, stone, hill, road, hand, sleep, and home. The first world a child receives is not the whole continent. It is the audible world nearby. 1. Geography shapes that audible world by shaping who is nearby. A valley can hold a group close enough for the same speech to keep returning. A high ridge can make outside influence less constant. A coast can bring contact, yet not always deep replacement. Over long periods, these conditions may help one language remain while others disappear. Yet the same conditions do not stop biological change. Bodies continue to meet. Families continue to form across local boundaries. Illness, hunger, land pressure, work and marriage move people in ways no border can fully control. That is why the Basque case is not a story of a people sealed away from history. It is a story of different inheritances moving at different speeds through the same landscape. DNA may record marriages and migrations that the language did not fully follow. Language may preserve a line of speech that ancestry alone could never prove. Archaeology may show tools, settlements, burials, and material habits, but it cannot always tell us which words were spoken beside them. The land holds all these traces without making them identical. Human origins are often misunderstood because people want a single beginning. They want one first group, one first language, one first homeland. But the real beginning of any people happens again and again. It happens whenever a child is born into an older world and learns how to belong there. It happens when a family keeps a name for a river. It happens when a community absorbs newcomers without losing its own daily speech. It happens when a wider power enters a region, but the inner voice of home remains slower to change. The Western Pyrenees offer one of Europe's clearest places to think about this. Mountains and sea did not preserve a pure remnant from before the Indo-Europeans. They helped create a setting where continuity could be stronger, contact could be filtered, and change could arrive without always erasing the older voice. In that sense, the Basque question is not only about who came first. It is about how place gives memory a body, and how human beginnings remain attached to ground long after the map around them has changed. Long before the farmers, the herders, the empires, and the written names of Europe, there were people living through the long afterlife of the Ice Age. They did not know themselves as hunter-gatherers, because that is a modern label placed on lives we can only partly understand. They were human communities moving through a continent of changing forests, coastlines, rivers, animals, seasons, and shelters. In Western Europe, after the Great Cold began to loosen, the land did not suddenly become the Europe we know today. Ice withdrew unevenly. Forests returned at different speeds. Sea levels changed. Animal ranges shifted. Human groups followed possibility, not borders. They moved where food could be found, where stone could be worked, where water flowed, where children might survive another season. This deep layer matters for the Basque question, because every later European population rests, in some measure, on earlier human presence. But it must be approached with care. We cannot say that any modern people are simply the unchanged continuation of those ancient groups. Time is too long, and the human story is too mixed. What we can say, more safely, is that ancient DNA from Western Europe has helped researchers identify older ancestry layers that entered the background of later populations. These layers did not remain pure. They were joined, reduced, reshaped, and carried forward in different amounts as new communities spread across the continent. In the Western Pyrenees and nearby regions, the memory of the earliest post-Ice Age people is not preserved as a complete living identity. It survives as traces, in genetic fragments, in archaeological remains, in stone tools, in bones, in landscapes once crossed by human feet. These traces do not speak like a language, but they remind us that before Basque, before Indo-European, before farming villages, there were already human bodies making a life in the western edge of the continent. For a sleep listener, the important thing is not to imagine them too clearly. We should not fill the darkness with invented faces, invented thoughts, or confident scenes that the evidence cannot support. It is enough to imagine the basic human condition, bodies needing warmth, food, kin, and shelter, moving within a world that was both familiar and dangerous. Their connection to the origin of later peoples is not a straight line, but a buried layer. Like old soil beneath a field, it remains present even when later roots grow through it. The Basque DNA mystery touches this layer because older discussions sometimes treated Basque people as if they were direct survivors from the Ice Age, almost unchanged while the rest of Europe transformed around them. Modern evidence makes that picture too simple. The Basques are not a frozen remnant of the first Western Europeans. Yet their region does sit close to places where ancient human presence was deep, and their later population history may have preserved some older Western European ancestry within a much more complex mixture. This is the difference between a trace and an identity. A trace can remain after many transformations. An identity is made and remade by language, family, land, and memory. The first genetic layer, then, should be understood as background, not as a final answer. It tells us that Europe began with many human lives before the better-known waves of farming and later migrations. It tells us that the body remembers more than any spoken tradition can hold. But it also warns us against turning ancestry into myth. The people of the Western Pyrenees did not step out of the Ice Age unchanged. No people did. What remains from that older world is quieter. Small pieces of inheritance carried through countless births, mingled with later arrivals, and still hidden inside the broader question of how one old language survived beside so much human change. Ancient DNA gives the Basque question a kind of evidence that older scholars did not have, but it does not give a simple answer. It allows researchers to compare living populations with remains from people who lived long before written history in Europe. From such work, one broad lesson has become clear. Modern Europeans are not descended from one single ancient population. They carry ancestry from several deep layers, including Western hunter-gatherers, early farming communities, and later groups connected to wider movements across the continent. The exact balance differs by region, but the larger pattern is one of mixture over time. For the Basque story, this matters because it gently corrects an older idea. Basque people were once sometimes imagined as a direct survival from the Ice Age, almost as if their DNA had passed untouched through all later changes. That picture is too clean. The body does not preserve history like a sealed jar. It preserves history through reproduction, and reproduction is always connected to meeting, marriage, survival, loss, and chance. A genetic trace can be ancient without making an entire population unchanged. Many people across Europe carry some inheritance from older hunter-gatherer groups, but those groups do not continue today as separate, untouched peoples. Their biological legacy has been mixed into later populations, often in small and uneven ways. This is a quiet but important distinction. When scientists find signs of old ancestry in a modern group, they are not finding a living fossil. They are finding a thread that has passed through many hands. In the human beginning, this is how continuity usually works. A child does not receive one pure past. A child receives a body made from many earlier bodies, some remembered by family names and most lost beyond memory. That child then grows inside a language, a place, and a community that may carry different kinds of inheritance from the genome itself. In the Basque case, DNA can show that the people of the Western Pyrenees are part of the larger biological history of Europe, not outside it. It can also show that their population history has certain regional patterns that differ from nearby populations. But DNA alone cannot say by itself when a language began, why it survived, or what the first speakers believed about themselves. The older hunter-gatherer layer is important because it reminds us that human life in Western Europe began long before the names and languages we can study directly. Yet it does not solve the Basque mystery. It only places the mystery on deeper ground. Archaeological traces from the older world show human presence, tools, movement, adaptation, and survival in changing environments. Genetic traces show that some ancestry from those older communities entered later populations. But neither kind of evidence allows us to point to modern Basque people and say they are simply the same people continuing unchanged from that distant time. The safer, more truthful statement is softer. Like other Europeans, Basque people carry ancestry formed by deep prehistoric layers, and some of those layers reach back toward Western Europe before farming. Their special importance lies not in untouched biology, but in the unusual combination of ancestry, geography, and a language that remained outside the Indo-European family. This combination gives the Basque story its power. The body records contact. The language records continuity of another kind. The land records the places where both contact and continuity could happen. If one looks only at DNA, the mystery becomes smaller, because Basque people are clearly human participants in the same long European mixture. If one looks only at language, the mystery becomes too large, almost mythical, because the survival of Basque can make the past seem more preserved than it really is. The truth lives between those mistakes. Older hunter-gatherer ancestry is a real background in Europe, but it is not a complete identity. It is one layer beneath later farming, herding, local isolation, regional marriage, and historical change. The Basque DNA mystery therefore begins to look less like a question of who remained pure, and more like a question of how different kinds of inheritance can survive at different depths inside the same people. The older hunter-gatherer layer beneath Europe should be held like a faint light under deep water. It is real, but it is not clear enough to turn into a simple identity. Basque people, like other Europeans, may carry traces from those earlier Western populations, yet those traces are only one strand in a much larger ancestry. They do not make the Basque a living copy of Ice Age Europe. They do not let us say that the first people of the Western Pyrenees are still present in an unchanged form. What they offer is quieter. They show that the human story in this region did not begin with the Indo-Europeans, nor even with the farmers who came before many Indo-European languages spread. There were already people in Western Europe, already bodies adapted to changing climates, already families moving through valleys, forests, coastlines, and shelters. Later populations grew out of contact between such older groups and newcomers, not out of one untouched source. The Basque mystery becomes more truthful when it is placed inside this layered beginning. The language may preserve a rare connection to pre-Indo-European Europe, but the genome preserves a different kind of record, made of mixture, loss, survival, and ordinary birth. These two records should not be forced to say the same thing. A language can stand apart while ancestry remains mixed. An ancestry can be ancient in small pieces while the community carrying it is historically much younger in its present form. This is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Human origins rarely survive as whole objects. They survive as fragments that keep changing. A stone tool in the ground, a genetic marker in a living body, a place name on a hill, a language spoken at home. Each one belongs to the past, but each one tells only a limited truth. In the Western Pyrenees, the deeper hunter-gatherer trace reminds us that before villages of farmers, before bronze, before iron, before Rome, there was already a human presence on the western edge of the continent. Yet the Basque people cannot be reduced to that presence. Their later history includes farming ancestry, regional continuity, local endogamy, contact with neighbours, and centuries of living beside powerful Indo-European languages. The old layer matters because it gives depth, not because it gives purity. It is like the first darkness beneath a forest floor, where older roots have decayed into soil that feeds new growth without remaining visible as the same tree. Thinking this way protects the question from becoming myth. If we call Basque Europe's oldest people without care, we may accidentally turn a complex human community into an artifact. But people are not artifacts. They are always being remade by children, marriages, food, work, language, and memory. The oldest layer inside them is not the whole person. It is one inheritance among many. The same is true for all human groups. Each carries traces from people who did not know our names, our nations, or our categories. Each stands on vanished lives that cannot be fully recovered. What makes the Basque case unusual is that one living language still points toward a world before Indo-European dominance, while the DNA points toward the broader truth of layered European ancestry. The two clues meet, but they do not merge into a single answer. They ask us to imagine continuity without stillness. They ask us to imagine change without total erasure. This returns us to the human beginning itself, not a single first doorway, but a long passage of bodies learning to live, speak, and belong in changing ground. Somewhere behind the modern Basque story is the deeper origin of Western European life after the Ice Age, but it is not preserved as a pure face looking back at us. It is preserved as a residue, a background, a quiet inheritance carried through bodies that kept changing and through voices that, in one rare corner of Europe, did not fall completely silent. Farming did not simply add new food to Europe. It changed the relationship between human bodies and the ground. Before farming spread widely across the continent, many communities lived by hunting, gathering, fishing, and moving with local possibilities. Their lives were varied, and we should not pretend to know them in full detail. But farming introduced a different rhythm. Seeds had to be planted, watched, protected, harvested, stored, and planted again. Animals had to be kept closer. People could remain longer in one place, and that staying changed the shape of childhood, work, illness, family, and memory. The spread of farming into Europe is usually connected with communities whose deeper origins lay toward the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. They did not enter an empty continent. They met older European groups, and over time their descendants mixed with them in many different ways. The result was not one clean replacement, but a long biological and cultural transformation. Food changed first in the most physical sense. Grain, domesticated animals, milk in some contexts, stored harvests, and managed fields altered what bodies could eat, how communities planned for seasons, and how many people a landscape might support. A field ties people to time differently from a forest path. A stored harvest makes the future feel heavier. A house that must be maintained across years creates another kind of attachment to place. Children born into farming villages did not simply inherit new ancestry. They inherited new tasks, new smells, new risks, and new daily sounds. Human beginnings continued there in the most ordinary way, through bodies learning the world around them. A child learned where the grain was kept, which animals belonged near the house, which paths led to fields, and which voices carried authority inside the family. This is where biology and culture became tightly braided. Farming could support larger populations in some regions, but crowded living also changed exposure to disease. Living close to animals and stored food could bring new pressures on health. More settled life could create new forms of labour, property, inheritance, and social difference. None of these changes should be painted as a simple improvement or decline. Farming gave some communities new stability and new vulnerability at the same time. It allowed growth, but also dependence. It created food stores, but also anxiety over failure. It made land more central to survival, and therefore made memory of place stronger in new ways. For the Basque question, the farming wave is crucial because it breaks the older myth of a population untouched since the Ice Age. The Western Pyrenees and surrounding Iberian regions were not outside the farming transformation. Ancient DNA studies have shown that ancestry connected with early farmers became important across much of Europe, including Iberia. This means that any truthful story about Basque origins must pass through farming. The Basque people cannot be described only as descendants of Western hunter-gatherers, nor as a biological island preserved before agriculture. Their ancestry, like that of other Europeans, was shaped by the arrival and mixing of farming communities with older populations. Yet, farming does not automatically explain the Basque language. A farming population could bring a language, adopt another, or mix speech across generations. Older local voices may have survived in some places, while elsewhere new languages spread. The human mouth does not follow the same rules as a seed. A seed planted in a field may produce a visible crop. A language planted in a household only survives if children keep hearing it as their first world. The farming wave changed bodies, settlements, disease, population size, and family life, but it did not erase every older voice in the same way everywhere. In the Basque story, farming gives us a deeper paradox. The people changed with Europe, but the later language still stood outside Indo-European Europe. The farming transformation gives the Basque DNA mystery one of its most important corrections. It reminds us that the people of the Western Pyrenees cannot be placed outside the great prehistoric changes that reshaped Europe. Older stories sometimes treated the Basque as if they were almost direct survivors from before farming, as if they had remained beside the Atlantic while the rest of the continent changed around them. That image is too simple. Ancient DNA has made the picture calmer, deeper, and less mythic. The ancestry of modern Basque people shows strong connection with ancient populations in Iberia after farming had already become established there. In other words, the Basque story does not skip the farming world, it passes through it. The people who later formed the biological background of the Basque-speaking region were not only heirs of older Western hunter-gatherers, they were also connected to farming communities whose ancestry had entered Iberia as agriculture spread across Europe. This does not mean that one group simply arrived, replaced everyone, and left a finished population behind. Human history rarely works with such clean lines. Farming communities mixed with older groups in different places and at different speeds. Their descendants became local in new landscapes. Over generations, people who once had deeper roots elsewhere became part of Iberian ground, Iberian valleys, and Iberian family lines. This is how human beginnings often continue. A person may carry ancestry from distant movements, but that ancestry becomes lived through local birth, local food, local weather, and local speech. A child born in a farming household does not feel like a migration map. The child feels hunger, warmth, fear, sleep, and the voices of those nearby. The body may carry a history stretching across regions, while the child's first world is the field, the house, the path, the animal pen, the hill, and the hands that provide care. This is why DNA can correct a myth without destroying the mystery. If Basque ancestry includes strong connections to ancient Iberian farming populations, then the idea of untouched Ice Age survival must be set aside. But the survival of a non-Indo-European language still remains. Farming changed bodies, food systems, settlement patterns, and population structures, yet it did not automatically decide which language would live in every household. A farming community could speak a language related to its own ancestors. It could adopt the speech of neighbours. It could blend with older communities while keeping one tongue or shifting to another. Across Europe, many early languages of farming people disappeared without leaving living descendants. In Iberia, the situation was especially layered. Older local populations, incoming farming ancestry, later regional developments, and eventually Indo-European speaking groups all entered the long story. The Basque case appears unusual because the language that survived in the Western Pyrenees does not belong to the Indo-European family, while the people who speak it are genetically part of the broader prehistoric and historic mixture of Europe. This combination is the heart of the puzzle. It suggests that a community can be deeply changed in ancestry while still preserving a language line that points to an older linguistic world. It also suggests that the preservation of a language may depend less on biological purity and more on social continuity. Who raises the children? Who speaks at home? Which language is used in work, marriage, memory, and belonging? Which valleys keep enough daily closeness for a voice to continue? The origin of a people is not stored in DNA alone. It is renewed whenever a child learns the first words for the world. In the Western Pyrenees, farming ancestry could become part of local bodies while an older or regionally rooted language continued to be transmitted. That possibility does not require certainty about the exact language spoken by every ancient farming village. It only requires caution. DNA can tell us that Basque biological history moved with the larger transformations of Iberia. It cannot tell us, by itself, what every household said at night. So the farming wave gives us a more honest paradox. Basque people are not outside Europe's prehistoric changes, yet their language did not dissolve into the Indo-European pattern that later covered most of the continent. Their DNA points toward integration. Their language points toward survival. Between those two facts lies the quieter truth. The oldest things in human history are not always the things that stayed unchanged, but the things that found a way to keep being carried through change. Here the paradox becomes most quiet and most important. Farming changed the ancestry of Europe, and Basque people were not separate from that change. Yet the Basque language did not become one of the Indo-European languages that later surrounded it. This means the story cannot be solved by saying that old blood kept an old tongue unchanged. It also cannot be solved by saying that new ancestry must always bring a new language. Human life is more patient and more complicated than either of those answers. In a farming world, people became tied more strongly to land, harvest, animals, houses, and inheritance. Families stayed longer in places where fields had to be worked again and again. Children grew up inside repeated tasks. They heard the same practical words every day, words for seed, rain, storage, hunger, illness, kin, boundary, and work. If an older local language remained useful inside those homes, it could continue even while ancestry changed. If newcomers entered a community and their children were raised in the local speech, the genome would remember the contact, but the language might still follow the valley. The opposite could also happen. A community with many local ancestors might adopt a different language because it belonged to a stronger network of trade, marriage, law, or prestige. Nothing in biology alone decides which voice a child will receive first. This is why the Basque case is so valuable for thinking about the origin of people. It separates two things that are often confused. Biological inheritance is passed through reproduction. Language is passed through learning. They meet in the family, but they are not the same inheritance. A child receives DNA silently, before any memory. A child receives language through sound, touch, repetition, correction, affection, and need. Farming made that household world more stable in many places. It gave families fields to return to and stores to protect. It may have made local speech more deeply tied to daily labour. But farming also opened new routes of change, because larger communities, more food production, and wider exchange could bring more contact between groups. In Iberia, ancient populations did not remain still. Older hunter-gatherer ancestry, farming ancestry, and later layers all entered the long human background. The Basque-speaking region was no exception to the movement of bodies. Its exception was linguistic, and even that should not be imagined as perfect stillness. Basque itself changed across time, as every living language changes. Sounds shift, words are borrowed, meanings drift. Grammar can alter slowly. A language can remain outside a family while still being shaped by neighbours. That may be the gentlest way to hold the paradox. The Basque language survived, but it did not survive as a frozen voice from an untouched beginning. It survived as a living voice, carried by changing people. This is more human than the myth. It shows that continuity can be an active process, not a passive preservation. Each generation had to learn the speech again. Each household had to make it normal again. Each child had to hear it enough for the language to enter the body as naturally as breathing. Such survival is not guaranteed. Across Europe, many non-Indo-European languages disappeared because the chain from adult to child weakened or broke. Basque remained because, for reasons linked to geography, community, and history, that chain did not break in the same way. The farming wave therefore leaves the Basque mystery deeper than before. It removes the fantasy of biological purity, but it strengthens the question of cultural endurance. It also brings the story back to the oldest human beginning. A body may come from many lines, while belonging is learned in the first circle of voices. How can a people change through ancestry, food, settlement, and contact, while keeping a voice that points beyond the Indo-European world around it? The answer is not ready yet. It lies ahead in later migrations, later powers, and the slow difference between what the body carries and what the mouth teaches. After farming had already changed much of Europe, another deep movement began to leave its mark on the continent. From the broad grasslands north of the Black Sea and farther across the Eurasian steppe, mobile pastoral communities became part of Europe's ancestry and history. They are often discussed in connection with horses, cattle, wagons, herding, and wide routes of movement, though the details should be handled with care. No ancient person stepped into Europe carrying a sign that said which language would survive. What researchers can see more clearly is the movement of ancestry, the spread of certain archaeological patterns, and the later dominance of many Indo-European languages. These clues point in the same general direction, but they are not the same clue. DNA can show that people moved and mixed. Archaeology can show changes in burial customs, tools, settlement patterns, and material life. Linguistics can compare words and structures across languages. Together, they suggest that movements connected to the steppe played an important role in the making of much later Europe. But none of these sources allows a simple sentence such as one people arrived and one language replaced everything. The truth is slower. The steppe was not only a place on a map, it was a way of living with distance. Open grasslands favour mobility in ways that mountain valleys do not. Herds need pasture. Families may move with animals. Social ties can stretch across large spaces. A world like that can carry people, ideas, and speech farther than a small farming valley might. When steppe-related ancestry entered Europe, it met communities already shaped by older hunter-gatherer layers and by farming ancestry. The result was not the birth of Europe from one source, but another powerful layer added to an already mixed continent. For the origin of people, this matters because every new movement becomes local only through children. A traveller, herder, spouse, or warrior may arrive from elsewhere, but ancestry becomes part of a region when children are born there, raised there, fed there, and taught to belong there. Across much of Europe, the later success of Indo-European languages suggests that some incoming or expanding social worlds were able to change not only bodies, but also speech. Yet the change was uneven. Some regions shifted language, others held older voices longer. Some older languages may have survived for centuries before fading. The Basque-speaking region is important because it sits inside Europe after these steppe-linked transformations, but its language did not become Indo-European. That does not mean no steppe-related ancestry ever entered the wider region. It means language survival cannot be read directly from ancestry alone. A community can receive new genetic threads while keeping an older speech chain alive. A family can absorb outsiders into local life so fully that the next generation speaks the language of the valley, not the language of the newcomer. Or a community can do the reverse, changing speech while much of its ancestry remains local. The Indo-European shadow, then, is not only the shadow of migration, it is the shadow of language replacement, prestige, kinship, power, and ordinary childhood learning. Around the Basque country, Indo-European languages gradually came to dominate. In Iberia and beyond, later languages would rise, fall, merge, and change under many historical pressures. Yet in the Western Pyrenees, a non-Indo-European language remained. This survival becomes more striking when placed against the steppe background, because it shows that even very large continental transformations do not erase every local pattern. Human history is not a flood that covers all ground at the same depth. It is water moving through uneven earth. Some places are submerged quickly. Some remain as islands for a time. Some absorb the water and still keep an older shape underneath. The Basque DNA mystery grows inside that unevenness. Steppe movements help explain why Indo-European languages became so widespread in Europe, but they do not explain why one language at the Atlantic edge kept standing outside that family. That question requires us to separate movement from replacement, ancestry from speech, and power from the quiet voice a child hears at home. Ancient DNA has changed the way Europe's past can be studied, but it also demands humility. It can reveal that people moved across long distances. It can show that ancestry from one region entered another. It can suggest that some communities mixed more than others, or that certain populations became more connected through time. But DNA does not preserve a spoken sentence. It does not record the first word a child learned for water, mother, sheep, mountain, or home. It cannot tell us with certainty what language every ancient person spoke while walking behind animals, burying the dead, trading with neighbours, or raising children beside a fire. This matters when thinking about the steppe and the spread of Indo-European languages. The broad pattern is important. Steppe-related ancestry appears in many areas of Europe, and many European languages later belong to the Indo-European family. Linguistics, archaeology, and genetics can be placed beside one another to build a careful picture. Yet they should not be forced into a single, rigid explanation. A genetic movement is not identical to a language movement. A burial custom is not identical to a grammar. A word reconstructed by linguists is not the same thing as a skeleton in the ground. Each clue belongs to the past, but each clue speaks in its own limited way. The origin of people is always more than one record. A human being is born from ancestry, but grows into a world of sound, habit, pressure, care, and memory. A child may carry genes from a newcomer and still learn the language of the local household. Another child may carry mostly local ancestry and still grow up speaking the language of a more powerful neighbour. Across Europe, both kinds of change likely happen many times. This is why the Basque question cannot be solved by asking only whether steppe ancestry reached a region. The deeper question is whether the chain of language transmission was broken. In many places, Indo-European languages became dominant because enough children began to learn them first. That could happen through migration, but also through prestige, alliance, trade, social hierarchy, intermarriage, or long contact. A language becomes powerful when it enters childhood. It becomes durable when it is spoken not only by strangers on roads, but by parents, grandparents, neighbours, and companions in the daily world. DNA can show that bodies met. It cannot alone show which voice became the voice of sleep, food, fear, work, and affection. In the Western Pyrenees, this distinction becomes essential. The region was not outside the movements that shaped Europe. No serious account should turn it into a sealed refuge where nothing entered and nothing changed. Yet the language that remained there did not become part of the Indo-European family. This suggests that, whatever ancestry entered over time, the local chain of speech had unusual strength. Perhaps geography helped, perhaps social networks helped. Perhaps the pattern of households, valleys, and local belonging gave the language enough room to remain ordinary across generations. Ordinary is the important word. Languages do not survive mainly because people place them in monuments. They survive because they are useful at breakfast, in the field, on a path, in a warning, in a lullaby, in the naming of a neighbour, in the quiet correction of a child. A language can withstand large historical forces if it continues to live in the small places where identity is first learned. This does not mean Basque was unchanged. Like every living language, it absorbed contact and moved through time. It borrowed, adjusted, and adapted. Its survival is not a refusal of history, but a different way of passing through history. Step-linked movements remind us that Europe was repeatedly remade by people on the move. The Basque survival reminds us that movement does not always produce the same result everywhere. Human beginnings were not erased simply because new ancestry arrived. They were rearranged. A body could carry many paths at once. A voice could keep one older path open while the body took in new branches of descent. That is the careful lesson ancient DNA offers here. It widens the story, but it does not replace language, archaeology, or geography. It tells us that the people of Europe came from layered encounters, not from pure origins. It also tells us that the mystery of Basque is not found in untouched blood, but in the distance between what ancestry can reveal and what speech can quietly preserve. The difference between blood and speech may be one of the quietest lessons in the Basque story. Blood, in the ordinary sense, stands for ancestry, for the long chain of parents and children through which bodies are made. Speech stands for learning, for the sounds received after birth from people close enough to be heard every day. These two inheritances meet in the same house, but they do not obey the same rules. A newborn receives a body before memory begins. That body carries traces from ancestors the child will never know, from marriages, migrations, losses, and survivals buried far beyond family memory. But language enters later, through breath, repetition, correction, comfort, command, and belonging. It enters when someone names water, calls the child near, warns of danger, or speaks softly at night. In many places, ancestry and language may travel together for a time, because people who move into a region often bring their speech with them. But the bond can loosen. A newcomer may marry into a local community, and the children may grow up speaking the local tongue. A village may keep much of its older ancestry, yet change language because another speech becomes useful, powerful, respected, or necessary. This is why the spread of Indo-European languages cannot be read simply as a map of genes. It is also why Basque cannot be understood as an untouched biological survival. The human origin behind every people is not one line, but a series of crossings. Bodies cross through reproduction. Words cross through childhood. Land holds both, but not in the same way. In the Western Pyrenees, these crossings may have created an unusual balance. New ancestry could enter without fully breaking the older chain of speech. Outside influence could arrive through roads, marriage, trade, military power, or religious change, while the language of home remained strong enough to keep being learned first. Over generations, that difference becomes enormous. The genome may record mixture, the mouth may preserve continuity, the community may experience both as normal life, not as a puzzle. Only much later, when scholars compare languages and scientists compare ancient DNA, does the separation become visible. For the people living inside it, the process may have felt like ordinary days. Children were born, food was prepared, fields were worked, animals were tended, rain fell on slopes. Names were repeated until they became natural. The deepest beginnings of human groups are often hidden in such ordinary repetition. A language survives not because it is ancient in itself, but because each generation makes it new inside a child. Ancestry survives differently, because it passes whether or not anyone speaks of it. This makes the Basque question especially powerful. If the language points toward a Europe before Indo-European dominance, and the DNA points toward layered mixture with ancient Iberian and wider European histories, then the real mystery lies between those records. What kind of social world allowed one non-Indo-European language to remain, while surrounding regions moved into other linguistic families? How much did geography matter? How much did household continuity matter? How much did local identity matter before the modern idea of identity even existed? These questions cannot be answered by one kind of evidence alone. A bone cannot speak its grammar. A word cannot reveal every ancestor. A mountain cannot tell us who married whom. But together, they show that human continuity is not the same as biological purity. A people can remain recognizable through language, place, and memory while changing through ancestry. A people can also lose an older language while carrying biological traces of those who once spoke it. Europe is full of such hidden separations. The Basque case is visible because one voice remained outside the Indo-European family long enough to make the separation clear. It asks us to slow the mind and stop looking for a single preserved beginning. The older beginning may be divided across many forms, some in DNA, some in speech, some in place, some in customs that change too much to be named with confidence. The steppe migrations and the Indo-European shadow show how wide human movement can be. Basque survival shows that even under that shadow, inheritance could still split into different paths, one carried silently in the body, another carried aloud from one generation to the next. By the time Iberia entered the Iron Age, the peninsula was not a single world waiting for Rome. It was a broad and uneven human landscape, with coastal contacts, inland settlements, hilltop communities, river valleys, mining zones, farming areas, pastoral routes, and many local traditions that cannot be reduced to one name. The map we use today did not exist. Spain and Portugal did not exist. France did not exist in the modern sense. Even the word Europe carried meanings very different from the ones later centuries would give it. What existed were people living in specific places, connected by terrain, kinship, trade, conflict, and memory. In the north, the mountains and Atlantic-facing valleys held their own rhythms. Along the Mediterranean, contact with Phoenician and Greek traders brought objects, techniques, and wider horizons into some regions. In the interior and the west, local communities followed different patterns of settlement and exchange. Some groups spoke Indo-European languages, or languages related to Indo-European branches. Others spoke languages that do not fit easily into that family. The linguistic picture was not clean, and it should not be made cleaner than the evidence allows. Iberia before Rome was a mosaic, and the Basque question belongs inside that mosaic, not outside it. This is important because the later survival of Basque can make the earlier past seem more singular than it was. But the peninsula was not simply divided between Basque and everything else. There were Iberian languages in the east and south, Celtic or Celtiberian languages in some inland regions, Tartessian or related inscriptions whose interpretation remains debated, and other local speech worlds that are only partly visible through inscriptions, place names, personal names, or later reports. Many voices were present. Some were written down only in fragments. Some were filtered through outsiders. Some disappeared before anyone could describe them carefully. Human beginnings are often lost in exactly this way, not because people did not live fully, but because their lives left evidence unevenly. A pot can break and remain. A tool can be buried and found. A name can survive on a stone. But an ordinary conversation between a parent and child vanishes unless another generation repeats the words. In Iron Age Iberia, languages lived in households, markets, fields, paths, and small political communities long before they entered the systems of Roman administration. Each child born into that world received ancestry from older layers of the peninsula and from later contacts, but received speech from the nearest human circle. That circle might be a valley, a town, a farmstead, a hill fort, or a coastal settlement. It might include people whose ancestors had come from different directions. It might include borrowed objects, foreign goods, and new social ties. Yet the first language of the child depended on the living voices close by, not on a neat label in a modern book. The Iron Age therefore gives the Basque mystery a more realistic frame. Basque was not the only non-Latin voice before Rome, and perhaps not the only non-Indo-European voice in the peninsula. What makes it extraordinary is that it survived while nearly all other ancient languages of Iberia vanished, changed beyond recognition, or were replaced by later Latin-derived languages and other historical tongues. This survival should not be treated as a miracle or a sealed inheritance. It should be treated as a long, uneven chain. Somewhere in the Western Pyrenees and surrounding zones, a speech tradition remained strong enough to pass from one generation to the next, while neighbouring linguistic worlds shifted under pressure from larger networks. The Iron Age was also a time of stronger regional identities, wider exchange, and increasing contact before Roman power transformed the peninsula. Metals, roads, alliances, warfare, trade, and social hierarchy all shaped how communities saw themselves and how they interacted with neighbours. But none of these forces acted uniformly. A valley could receive goods without changing its household language. A community could adopt new styles of burial, tools, or exchange while still speaking its inherited tongue. Another could change speech, because political or economic life made another language more useful. The origin of a people, seen at this scale, is never one event. It is a repeated choice made without being recognized as a choice, to speak to children in the voice of home. Iron Age Iberia shows us the world just before one of the great language transformations of the peninsula. Rome had not yet turned Latin into the deep foundation of later Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician, and French around the Basque region. The older voices were still present, though many were already vulnerable because they lived mostly in fragile human transmission. Basque stands near that vanished crowd. It is not a complete survivor of all pre-Roman Iberia. It is one living remnant of a wider lost soundscape, shaped by the same human conditions that shape every origin: bodies moving, families forming, children listening, and places giving memory somewhere to remain. The Iron Age gives the Basque DNA mystery a clearer shape because it brings the story closer to a population world that can be compared with ancient genetic evidence more carefully than the far older Ice Age background. The safest way to say it is this: modern Basque people should not be described as an untouched survival from the first people of Europe, but they may preserve a stronger relationship to certain ancient Iberian population patterns than many surrounding groups do after later historical changes. That is a very different claim. It does not say that nothing changed. It says that some later layers of mixture may have affected the Basque-speaking region differently from other regions. In a calm reading of the evidence, Basque ancestry appears less like a straight tunnel into the deep past, and more like a local continuation from prehistoric and early historic Iberia, shaped by farming ancestry, older Western European layers, and regional patterns of marriage and community. This is why the Iron Age matters. It sits near the threshold between pre-Roman Iberia and the later world of written empires. It is late enough to stand closer to historically recognizable regions, but early enough to preserve a world before Latin and later Romance languages reshaped most of the peninsula. If modern Basque DNA has often been discussed as showing continuity with ancient Iberian populations from around this broad period, the meaning should be handled gently. Continuity does not mean purity. Continuity means that enough people, families, and local lines remained connected across generations for a recognizable pattern to persist. A river can continue while receiving many streams. A population can continue while absorbing new people. A language can continue while borrowing words and changing sound. The human beginning inside this is not a single frozen ancestor. It is a chain of births taking place in a familiar landscape. A child born in the Western Pyrenees in a pre-Roman world would have entered a community already made of many earlier layers. That child's body might carry ancestry from old hunter-gatherer backgrounds, from farming populations, from regional Iberian mixtures, and from contacts not visible in any simple story. But the child's first speech would come from nearby adults. If those adults kept teaching a local non-Indo-European language, then the language could survive, even while the biological background was already mixed. This helps explain why the Basque case is so easily misunderstood. People hear that Basque is old and they imagine a people unchanged from the beginning. But the better image is a community whose later history may have avoided some of the stronger language and population shifts that transformed surrounding areas, while still living through ordinary human contact. The Iron Age world was full of movement, but not all movement has the same consequence. A trader arriving with goods might leave little genetic trace but many borrowed words. A spouse from another valley might alter ancestry in the next generation but enter the local language. A larger political power might change laws and roads before changing what children hear at home. Over time, these differences become the texture of a people. Ancient DNA can notice some of the texture, but it cannot explain all of it. It can show that the Basque are not a separate biological category outside Europe. It can also suggest that their population history has a distinctive regional continuity. The language then adds another layer, because it remained outside Indo-European even after Indo-European languages spread widely around it. The two clues meet in the Iron Age like two paths coming near one another without becoming the same road. One path is ancestry, the other is speech. Between them lies the social life of generations. Who married whom, who stayed near home, which valleys remained closely connected, which outside languages became useful, and which local voice kept being spoken to children. This is where the phrase "Europe's oldest people" must be softened until it becomes truthful. The Basque are not old because they are unchanged. They are old in the sense that their language and some regional population continuity point back toward a Europe before the later dominance of Indo-European and Latin-derived worlds. Their value is not in a fantasy of untouched origin. Their value is in showing how deeply human continuity can be. Altered in the body, pressured by history, surrounded by stronger languages, yet still able to carry one fragile line of speech across the dark spaces where so many other voices disappeared. From the Iron Age Basque puzzle, a deeper question begins to rise. What if the longest survival was never a pure body, but a durable chain of belonging? A genetic line can be interrupted, widened, or redirected by marriage and migration. A language line can also be changed by borrowing, pressure, and contact. But for a language to remain alive, something very specific must happen again and again. Adults must speak it to children. Children must answer in it. The words must be useful for hunger, work, fear, kinship, weather, animals, paths, and sleep. The language must not only be remembered, it must remain ordinary. That may be the central lesson of Basque before Rome. The people of the Western Pyrenees were not outside the movements of Iberia, and their ancestry should not be imagined as sealed away from the rest of Europe. Yet a local speech tradition endured in a region where many other ancient voices would eventually disappear. This kind of endurance is not passive. It is a living structure held by households, neighbouring families, seasonal work, marriage habits, and the quiet authority of local life. In the origin of every people, there is always a moment when biology becomes culture, not because blood turns into language, but because a newborn body is placed inside a human circle. That circle gives the child a name, food, touch, rhythm, and speech. If the circle remains strong across generations, Identity can continue even while ancestry becomes more complex. The Basque case may be one of Europe's clearest examples of that difference. Ancient DNA can bring the population closer to the old Iberian world, especially compared with groups more strongly reshaped by later movements, but it cannot make the people into an unchanged remnant. The survival of Basque language suggests something more social and more fragile, a community pattern strong enough to keep transmitting a non-Indo-European voice, while the wider peninsula moved through Iron Age diversity, Roman expansion, Latin, and later historical transformations. That pattern may have depended on geography, but not geography alone. Mountains can slow change, but they do not teach children by themselves. Valleys can hold communities, but they cannot choose which words are spoken at night. The survival had to occur in human habits. It had to live in the repeated decision, often not felt as a decision at all, to speak as parents and neighbours spoke. It had to survive moments when another language might have been more useful beyond the valley, when trade, power, or administration favoured different words. It had to be flexible enough to borrow and adapt, yet stable enough not to dissolve. This is why the Basque story should not be turned into a tale of purity. Purity is brittle, and human history is not brittle. It is porous. It receives strangers, losses, marriages, tools, crops, beliefs, and pressures. What lasts is often not what refuses contact, but what can absorb contact without losing its own path of transmission. A people may preserve continuity because their local world remains meaningful enough for children to inherit it. The voice of home can sometimes outlast the voice of power, especially when power does not fully enter the intimate spaces of family life. Across Europe, countless old languages lost that protection. They may have faded when children began to answer in a newer tongue. Their speakers did not vanish as bodies. Their descendants may still live, carrying ancestry without the old speech. Basque makes that hidden loss visible by showing the opposite possibility. In one Western region, a voice did not simply vanish into the larger Indo-European soundscape. It changed, but it continued. It stood near the vanished voices of ancient Iberia as the one that remained audible. The mystery, then, is not whether an ancient people avoided change. The mystery is how enough change could happen without breaking the chain. It is how a community could pass through time with a mixed body, a local land, and a language old enough to point toward a Europe whose other voices have mostly fallen silent. When Rome entered Iberia, it did not enter a silent land. It entered a peninsula already full of older peoples, older names, older trade routes, older rivalries, and older languages. Roman power arrived first through war and alliance, then through roads, towns, law, taxation, soldiers, merchants, settlers, and administration. Over time, Latin became more than the speech of officials. It became a language of opportunity, order, movement, and public life. In many places, it slowly entered the daily world deeply enough that later generations no longer spoke the earlier languages of their ancestors. This did not happen overnight. A farmer did not wake one morning and find the old voice erased. A child did not stop hearing a family language because a road was built far away. Language change usually moves more quietly than conquest. It moves when the speech of power becomes useful, when marriage connects households across language lines, when markets favour one tongue, when soldiers settle, when legal life rewards a shared language, and when children begin to learn the new voice as something normal. Rome's great strength was not only military, it was the ability to make many distant places participate in the same system. Roads joined valleys and towns, cities drew people into wider networks, written records carried law and property, the army moved men across long distances, trade made local life part of a larger economy. In much of Iberia, these forces helped Latin spread so deeply that it eventually formed the roots of later Romance languages. Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician, and French around the Basque region all belong to later histories shaped by Latin. Yet the Basque language did not become Latin. It lived beside Latin, borrowed from Latin and later Romance languages, and was touched by them. But it did not descend from them. This survival should not be described as if Roman history failed to reach the Western Pyrenees. Rome did reach the wider region. Roman influence, roads, Military presence, trade, and administration affected northern Iberia in different ways. But influence is not the same as complete replacement. The human beginning behind this is still the household. A state can name a road, a court can use a law, a merchant can count goods in another tongue, but a child first learns speech from the intimate circle of care. If that circle continues to use the older local language, then public power may change the outside world while the inner voice remains alive. This distinction may help explain why Basque survived when many other ancient languages of Iberia disappeared. It was not because the language was sealed away from Latin. Living languages are never sealed. Basque absorbed loanwords and changed through contact, as all languages do. Its survival was not a refusal of Roman history, but a different outcome within it. The Western Pyrenees may have given local speech more shelter than open corridors did. Scattered communities, mountain valleys, strong local ties, and daily life outside major urban centres may have slowed the full replacement of household language. Still, geography alone cannot carry a voice across centuries. People had to keep using it. Parents had to speak it to children. Neighbours had to answer in it. It had to remain useful not only as memory, but as living speech. This is where the Basque DNA mystery becomes more than a question of ancestry. Roman roads could bring people, goods, soldiers, and ideas. They could change marriage networks and social status. They could leave marks in DNA over time. But DNA cannot tell us which language a mother used when waking a child before dawn, or which words a shepherd used on a wet slope, or which name a family kept for a nearby stream. The Roman world shows how powerful language replacement can be, yet it also shows that replacement is never automatic. Across much of Western Europe, Latin transformed the linguistic future. In the Basque country, it shaped the surrounding world without fully breaking the older chain. That chain, altered and pressured, remained strong enough to carry a non-Indo-European language through one of the greatest political and linguistic transformations Europe had ever known. As Latin deepened its roots in Iberia and Gaul, it did not remain the same Latin forever. Spoken languages change in mouths, especially when they are carried across mountains, farms, towns, ports, military camps, and households far from their older centre. Over centuries, local forms of Latin shifted into the Romance languages that later surrounded the Basque-speaking world. To the west and south, the ancestors of Spanish and related Iberian Romance languages grew out of Latin shaped by local histories. To the north and east, the ancestors of French and other Romance varieties developed through their own long changes. Around the Western Pyrenees, the old Roman language did not disappear. It transformed. It became the foundation of powerful neighbouring tongues, languages of kingdoms, law, writing, trade, church life, and public authority. Basque remained beside them, but not in a wide, untouched field. Its space narrowed, moved, and changed. That narrowing is important because survival should not be confused with expansion. A language can survive while losing territory. It can remain alive while becoming more local, more pressured, and more surrounded. The Basque language did not need to dominate Europe in order to matter. Its importance lies in the fact that it continued at all, while the older languages around it mostly vanished or were absorbed into Latin-derived speech. Human beginnings are often hidden in such unequal outcomes. One village may shift language because the surrounding economy demands it. Another may keep its inherited speech because family networks, mountain ties, and local identity still make it useful. A child born near a border between languages does not experience history as a map. The child hears one language at home, another in trade, another in church, another from officials, another from travellers. Over time, one of those voices may become stronger, but the first voice of home can sometimes remain deeply rooted, especially when enough families keep teaching it before the outside world becomes louder. Basque survived in that intimate space. It lived beside Latin and later Romance languages, borrowing words and being shaped by contact, yet keeping a structure and ancestry of speech separate from them. This does not mean Basque was unchanged. No living language stays still. Its sounds, vocabulary, and usage moved through time. Its speakers lived among neighbours, crossed borders, traded goods, paid taxes, entered religious life, and faced pressures from larger political systems. The survival was not a silence against history. It was a continuing conversation with history. Romance languages grew around it like a forest of newer trees rooted in Roman soil, while Basque remained like an older tree still living in a smaller clearing, touched by the same rain, sharing the same ground, but not growing from the same root. That image is imperfect, as all images are, because people are not trees and languages do not have single trunks. Still, it helps us feel the shape of the problem. A language may be surrounded without being dissolved. A people may live in contact without becoming identical to their neighbours. DNA may show mixture, while speech preserves a boundary that biology alone cannot explain. The rise of Romance languages around Basque also reminds us how much has been lost. The ancient voices of Iberia did not all become modern languages. Many disappeared beneath Latin, leaving fragments in inscriptions, names, or scholarly reconstruction. Basque stands apart because it remained alive long enough to be heard directly. It does not let us hear the whole pre-Roman peninsula, but it keeps open one narrow doorway into a Europe where other language families once existed. The mystery is therefore not that Basque avoided every outside force. The mystery is that outside forces became strong enough to reshape nearly everything nearby, yet not strong enough to fully replace the language carried in certain homes, valleys, and generations. Political power can be immense and still fail to reach the first language of a child. Rome could build roads, count taxes, settle veterans, move soldiers, organize towns, and make Latin useful across great distances, but no empire automatically enters the cradle. The language of public life and the language of intimate life often move at different speeds. A person might use one tongue in a market, another before an official, another in prayer, and another at home with parents and children. Over generations, the public tongue can become the home tongue, and then the older language begins to fade. That happened in many places. But the process depends on transmission, not power alone. If enough families keep speaking the local language where children first learn the world, then even a strong political system may reshape the surface of life without fully replacing the deeper voice. This is one of the quiet reasons Basque survived beside Latin and later Romance languages. It was not protected by being invisible to history. It was protected, if that word can be used gently, by remaining normal inside certain communities. Normal speech is stronger than it seems. It does not need monuments. It needs repeated use. It needs a grandmother correcting a child, a neighbour calling across a path, a parent naming rain, a worker giving instructions, a family speaking after dark when official languages are far away. The origin of a people is renewed in those moments, because belonging is not only remembered, it is rehearsed by the body. A child learns where home is through sound as much as through sight. The first words attach to food, touch, danger, comfort, work, and sleep. When those words remain local across generations, they can outlast kingdoms that seem much stronger from the outside. Still, this survival should not be mistaken for resistance in every moment. A community can keep its language while also borrowing from the powerful language nearby. Basque took words from Latin and from Romance neighbours, as living languages often do. Borrowing is not surrender. It can be a way of continuing. A language may accept new words for new tools, beliefs, laws, foods, or social realities, while keeping its own structure and its own path of descent. The same is true of people. A population may receive newcomers, absorb marriages, and change genetically without losing its everyday voice. Rome's influence could alter roads, trade, religion, administration, and social ambition. But the final test of language survival was always whether children continued to answer in the older speech. Geography helped make that possible in the Western Pyrenees. Valleys, slopes, and scattered settlements could keep local networks dense. The mountains could slow the full reach of outside speech into every household, while the coast and passes still allowed contact. That combination mattered. Complete isolation might preserve less than people imagine, because a sealed world can become fragile. Contact without full replacement may be more durable. It allows a community to adapt without dissolving. In the Basque case, the old voice seems to have passed through Roman pressure in that way, touched, changed, narrowed, but not broken. Around it, Latin became the deep root of powerful Romance languages. Many older Iberian voices disappeared, not because every speaker was killed or removed, but because their descendants learned another language first. This is one of the great quiet erasures in human history. Bodies continued, but voices did not. Ancestry remained, but the words that once carried childhood vanished. Basque makes that loss visible by showing what it means for one chain not to break. It also teaches caution. Survival is not the same as victory, and continuity is not the same as purity. The Basque language lived because enough people kept giving it to children, while also living inside a world shaped by stronger neighbours. The mystery is not that Roman power was weak. The mystery is that human speech can sometimes hide in the smallest places, and those smallest places can preserve what roads, laws, and empires cannot fully command. Isolation is an easy word to misunderstand. It can make a place sound closed, untouched, and separate from the ordinary movement of human life. But in the Basque story, isolation should mean something much softer and more precise. It should mean relative separation, not complete separation. It should mean fewer pathways of mixing at certain times, not an absence of contact. It should mean a landscape and a society where outside influence arrived, but often through narrower doors than in wider plains, large cities, or major corridors of empire. The Western Pyrenees were never beyond history. People moved through them, around them, and out of them. Goods travelled. Marriage connected families. Latin and later Romance languages pressed close. Religious life, law, war, trade, and modern states all reached the region in different ways. Yet the Basque-speaking world seems to have maintained a stronger local continuity than many neighbouring regions, especially in the transmission of language and in some patterns of population structure. That is the careful meaning of isolation here. It is not a wall, it is a slower current. Human groups have always lived between closeness and openness. From the earliest beginnings, people needed others beyond the immediate family. They needed partners, allies, knowledge, exchange, and sometimes refuge. No community can remain completely sealed for long without becoming vulnerable. But too much outside pressure can weaken local speech, local memory, and the ordinary habits that make a community feel continuous. The Basque case appears to sit between these extremes. The region was open enough to be changed, but not always open enough for every outside layer to erase what was already there. This is why purity is the wrong word. Purity suggests a clean substance that can be spoiled by contact. Human populations are not clean substances. They are histories of contact made flesh. Every person carries ancestry shaped by many earlier meetings, and most of those meetings are not remembered by name. Even in regions with relative isolation, people are born from mixed histories. A valley may have a strong local identity while still receiving spouses from nearby valleys. A language may remain distinct while borrowing words. A genetic pattern may look regionally recognizable while still carrying many ancient layers. Relative isolation can preserve difference, but it does not preserve untouched origin. This distinction protects the Basque mystery from becoming a false story. If we imagine the Basque as pure survivors before the Indo-Europeans, we erase the very human processes that made their survival possible. If we imagine them as no different from their neighbours, we miss the real pattern of continuity that makes the case worth asking about. The truth is quieter. A population can be relatively endogamous for periods of time, meaning many people choose partners within nearby communities more often than outside them. Such patterns can make certain genetic features more common locally, not because the people are outside humanity, but because families have remained connected within a limited social space. Over generations, that social space can leave a trace in DNA. But the same pattern also helps language survive. When marriage, childhood, work and belonging remain centered in a local network, children are more likely to keep hearing the local voice as their first voice. This brings the question back to the origin of people in its simplest form. A people begins again whenever a child is born into a circle of care. The child receives a body from ancestry, but receives belonging from the nearby world. If that nearby world is strongly local, both DNA and language may carry a special regional shape, yet neither becomes frozen. Birth keeps changing the body, Speech keeps changing the language. Contact keeps adding new material. Memory keeps choosing what feels familiar. In the Basque-speaking region, isolation without purity may be the best way to understand the long survival. Mountains, valleys, coastal edges, local marriage patterns, and household speech may have worked together to slow replacement without stopping change. The old language endured not because history failed to enter, but because history entered unevenly. Outside powers reached the roads before they reached every bedtime voice. Larger languages became useful beyond the home before they became the only language of home. Ancestry mixed through ordinary life, while local speech remained strong enough to be renewed. That is why the Basque DNA Mystery is not a search for an untouched people. It is a search for the conditions under which a changing people could remain recognizably themselves across a very long time. Several forces may have helped the Basque-speaking region keep a distinct shape, but none of them should be treated as a single cause. Human continuity usually comes from many small pressures working together for a long time. The first pressure is geography. The Western Pyrenees do not form an absolute barrier, but they create uneven movement. Valleys can make everyday life close and repeated. Slopes can make distance feel larger than it looks on a map. Weather can slow travel. Pastures, rivers, wooded hills, and coastal routes can tie people to familiar circuits of work. In such a landscape, a community may meet outsiders often enough to change, yet not so constantly that every local habit is dissolved. The second pressure is marriage. Over many generations, if people more often choose partners from nearby villages, neighbouring valleys, or familiar families, the population can develop a regional pattern. This does not make the people pure. It only means that the same social circle keeps renewing itself more often than it is replaced from outside. A third pressure is the structure of village life. When households are tied to land, inheritance, local work, and kin networks, speech can remain deeply rooted because it is needed in the most ordinary moments. A language survives when it is used for naming tools, calling children, settling small conflicts, sharing food, speaking to animals, remembering the dead, and explaining the weather. These are not grand historical events, but they are the places where a voice either lives or disappears. The Basque mystery becomes clearer when these pressures are viewed together. Mountains may slow contact. Local marriage may strengthen regional continuity. Village life may keep the language useful. Identity may grow from repeated belonging rather than from any theory of ancestry. Over time, these conditions can make a community different enough for DNA to show regional patterns and for language to remain separate, even while contact continues. The origin of a people is renewed inside such ordinary systems. A newborn receives a body from parents, but that body is immediately placed into a social world. The child hears who belongs, which house is known, which slope has a name, which path is dangerous, which families are connected, which language is used when no outsider is listening. The child learns not only words but a map of closeness. That map may be more powerful than the political map outside it. A kingdom can change, a border can move. A ruling language can enter courts, churches, schools, or markets. But if the intimate map of childhood continues to be local, an older language may remain alive. This may be one reason Basque endured besides stronger neighbouring languages. It was not only protected by mountains, it was protected by being woven into life strongly enough that replacing it would have meant changing the first world of children. Yet the same conditions could not freeze the people. Local communities still borrowed words. They still interacted with neighbours. They still lived through war, religion, trade, state pressure, and economic change. They still received new ancestry through marriage and movement. Relative isolation allowed a recognisable pattern to endure, but it did not stop time. This is why the phrase oldest people must always be handled gently. A people can be old because certain continuities lasted. It cannot be old because every ancestor, word, custom, and body remained the same. In the Basque-speaking region, local continuity may have depended on a balance between openness and inward strength. Too little contact can make a community fragile and poor in exchange. Too much pressure can break the local chain of speech. Between these extremes, a language may adapt while remaining itself. It may take foreign words into its mouth without surrendering its deeper identity. It may share land with larger languages without becoming one of them. The same is true for population structure. A region may receive outside ancestry, yet still maintain enough local marriage and continuity for its genetic profile to differ from surrounding groups. What makes Basque important is not one of these forces alone, but their meeting. Terrain that slowed replacement, social habits that renewed local belonging, and a language that continued to be taught before children fully entered the wider world. In that meeting, the Basque DNA mystery becomes less like a locked door and more like a long-burning ember. It survived not because no wind touched it, but because the conditions around it kept feeding it carefully enough that it did not go out. The safest lesson from the Basque story is that difference does not require purity. A community can remain distinct because certain patterns continue, even while bodies, words, customs, and relationships keep changing. This matters because the language of ancestry can easily become dangerous when it is simplified. If people hear that Basque is old, they may imagine a hidden biological essence protected since the beginning of Europe, but science does not support that kind of story. Ancient DNA points toward mixture, layers, local continuity, and uneven change. Language history points toward the survival of a non-Indo-European voice in a region where surrounding languages took other paths. Geography points toward relative shelter, not complete separation. When these clues are placed together, they do not create a myth of untouched blood. They create a more human picture, a changing population that preserved certain forms of continuity more strongly than many neighbouring regions did. That is why old must be understood carefully. Old can mean that a language line reaches back before the Indo-European languages around it. Old can mean that a region preserved local population patterns from ancient Iberia more visibly than places later reshaped by stronger movements. Old can mean that names, habits, and belonging stayed attached to valleys and hills across many generations. But old does not mean unmixed. It does not mean fixed. It does not mean closer to some imagined original humanity. Every human group begins in movement, because the first condition of human life is not purity but need. Bodies need food, water, warmth, care, and other bodies. From the earliest communities onward, people met, exchanged, married, separated, returned, and adapted. No child is born from an idea of purity. A child is born from generations of contact, then raised inside a smaller world of speech and touch. In the Basque-speaking region, that smaller world may have remained unusually strong. Local marriage networks may have helped keep population structure recognizable. Mountain and coastal geography may have slowed the complete replacement of older speech. Village life may have kept the language useful in the daily spaces where children first learned who they were, but none of this makes the community untouched. It makes the community continuous through change. The difference is not small. Purity is a claim about exclusion. Continuity is a story about transmission. Purity asks what was kept out. Continuity asks what was carried forward. The Basque case becomes more truthful when we ask the second question. What was carried forward was not a complete prehistoric world. It was not the full language of every ancient Iberian group, not the full ancestry of the first Western Europeans, not the full memory of lives before writing. Much of that is gone. What remained was a living language, a regional pattern of belonging, and a population history shaped by many layers but not dissolved into all the same patterns as its neighbours. This is why the word isolation needs quiet handling. Relative isolation can leave real traces. It can influence DNA by limiting the average range of marriage over time. It can influence language by keeping children inside a strong local speech community. It can influence memory by tying identity to familiar land. Yet isolation is never the absence of the outside world. Even the most rooted valley has paths. Even the most local language borrows. Even the most continuous community changes with birth, death, hunger, faith, law, trade, and time. The origin of people should be imagined in this way, not as a pure spring untouched by later water, but as a stream that keeps its course while receiving rain from many skies. The Basque DNA mystery teaches that being ancient is not the same as being unchanged. A people can carry an old voice and a mixed body. A people can preserve a regional pattern without standing outside humanity. A people can be deeply connected to a place while still being made by all the ordinary movements that make us human. The real wonder is not purity. The real wonder is that anything fragile survives at all when every generation must carry it again. DNA is one of the most powerful records human beings have learned to read, but it is also a record with silence inside it. It can show relationships between populations. It can reveal that people moved, mixed, separated, and met again. It can show that one region preserved more of a certain ancestry pattern than another, or that a later movement changed the biological background of a place. It can reach back farther than family memory and sometimes farther than written history. Yet DNA cannot tell the whole story of a people, because a people is not only a chain of biological inheritance. A people is also language, place, habit, law, food, grief, memory, work, and the repeated care of children. The genome does not remember the song sung to a baby. It does not keep the tone of a grandmother's warning, the name of a hill spoken at dusk, the rule for sharing land, the way neighbours greeted each other, or the private meaning of a river bend. It does not tell us which language a child heard when falling asleep. It does not tell us whether an old word was loved, feared, forgotten, or replaced. For the Basque DNA mystery, this limitation is not a weakness to ignore. It is the centre of the problem. DNA can help correct false stories about untouched origin. It can show that Basque people, like all Europeans, carry a layered ancestry shaped by ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers, later population structures, and historical contact. It can suggest relative continuity in a region when compared with surrounding populations, but it cannot explain by itself why Basque remained outside the Indo-European family. It cannot show the exact moment when one household chose, or simply continued, to speak one language instead of another. It cannot tell us why some children kept receiving the local voice while other ancient European children gradually received Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, or other Indo-European tongues. This is where the origin of people becomes more than biology. A newborn body is ancient in one sense, because it contains traces of many generations. But that body becomes human in a social sense through touch, food, rhythm, and speech. The first world of a child is not a genetic chart. It is a room, a path, a field, a slope, a voice nearby. The child learns belonging before understanding ancestry. In the Western Pyrenees, DNA may reveal a regional shape, but the survival of Basque depends on something DNA cannot directly record: the continued transfer of language from living adults to living children. The difference is gentle but deep. Ancestry can pass without awareness. Language cannot. Someone must speak. Someone must answer. Someone must repeat the word until it becomes natural. If that chain breaks, the old language can disappear even while descendants of its speakers remain alive. This happened many times in Europe. Bodies continued, but voices vanished. DNA might still carry traces of the people who once spoke those lost languages, yet the languages themselves cannot be recovered from the genome. A bone can show ancestry, but not a lullaby. A genetic pattern can show connection, but not the sound of home. This is why the Basque case should be approached with humility. It is not enough to ask what the blood preserved. We must also ask what the home preserved, what the valley preserved, what ordinary speech preserved, and what all of them failed to preserve. Every form of evidence gives a different kind of light. DNA lights the body, archaeology lights material life, language lights transmission, geography lights the paths through which people met or stayed apart. None of these lights is complete alone. If DNA is treated as the final answer, the Basque language becomes almost invisible. If language is treated as the final answer, the biological complexity of the people becomes invisible. The truth requires both, held together without forcing them into one story. A people can be ancient in language and mixed in ancestry. A people can be regionally continuous and still changed by time. A people can remember a name for a mountain while forgetting many older names forever. The Basque DNA mystery, then, is not a puzzle that DNA alone can solve. It is a reminder that human beings are more than the traces their bodies leave behind. Language can feel closer to the soul of a people than DNA, because it carries sound, memory, and the first names of the world. Yet language also has limits. It can survive for a very long time and still hide most of its own past. Basque is living proof of continuity. but not a recording of ancient Europe." Unquote. When a person speaks Basque today, that voice belongs to the present, shaped by modern life, centuries of contact, borrowed words, internal change, and living communities. It may point toward a pre-Indo-European layer of Europe, but it does not let us hear exactly how people spoke in the Western Pyrenees before Rome, before the Iron Age, before farming, or before the deeper transformations of the continent. Spoken language is fragile unless it is written down, and much of human speech existed only in breath. For most of prehistory, words were not preserved on durable surfaces. They moved from mouth to ear, from elder to child, from one day to the next. If that movement stopped, the language vanished almost completely. Linguists can compare living languages, study older texts, examine inscriptions, analyze place names, and look for patterns in sound and grammar. These methods are careful and powerful, but they cannot bring back every lost conversation. They cannot tell us the full voice of a mother speaking to a child in an unwritten valley. They cannot tell us whether an old word was common, sacred, ordinary, playful, or nearly forgotten. They cannot fully recover the languages that disappeared without enough written evidence. This is especially important for the Basque question, because Basque is often treated as if it were a window directly opened onto Europe before the Indo-Europeans. It is better to think of it as a living doorway that still stands after most of the older building has disappeared. The doorway is real. It matters deeply, but it does not show the entire house. We can say that Basque is not known to belong to the Indo-European family, and that makes it extraordinary in Europe. We can say it preserves a linguistic survival where most other older voices were replaced. But we should not claim to know exactly what the earliest Basque-like speech sounded like, how far it once spread, or how every ancient speaker understood their own identity. The origin of people is always partly hidden because people lived long before they left strong records. A human group could carry a language for generations, change it slowly, borrow from neighbours, shift its sounds, and still feel that it was speaking naturally. No generation experiences its own language as ancient. Children simply hear what adults speak around them. They do not know that a word may be carrying a past older than any local story. They know only that the word works. It names rain, bread, sheep, stone, pain, home, sleep, and the faces they trust. This is why language survival is both intimate and incomplete. It tells us that a chain continued, but it does not reveal every link in that chain. Basque may preserve a rare continuity of speech outside Indo-European Europe, yet its own earlier stages are partly beyond reach. The language has changed because all living languages change. Contact with Latin, Romance languages, and later political worlds left traces. Some words entered from outside, some older forms disappeared, some meanings shifted. That does not make Basque less ancient in its position. It makes it alive. A language that never changes is usually a language no longer spoken by children. Living speech survives by adapting. An adaptation leaves marks that can blur the oldest layers. So language, like DNA, must be read with humility. DNA cannot tell us the sound of a word. Language cannot tell us every ancestor in the body. Archaeology cannot always connect a tool to a tongue. Geography cannot decide what people said beside a fire. Each clue is partial. In the Basque DNA mystery, the most truthful picture comes from letting each clue remain limited. Basque language shows that a non-Indo-European voice survived at the Atlantic edge of Europe. DNA shows that the people who carried that voice were shaped by layered ancestry, not by untouched descent. Archaeology shows human presence and material life, but not always speech. History shows later pressures, but not every household choice. The lost voices of Europe remain lost in large measure. Basque does not restore them all. It only reminds us that they once existed, and that one living language can carry both a presence and an absence at the same time. The most honest picture of the Basque mystery does not come from choosing one source of evidence and making it rule over all the others. It comes from placing several incomplete records beside one another, like small lamps around a dark room. DNA lights one wall. It shows ancestry, mixture, local continuity, and the fact that no living population is a sealed remnant from the deep past. Archaeology lights another wall. It shows where people lived, what they made, what they buried, how they changed tools, settlements, foodways, and material habits. Language lights a third wall. It shows that one non-Indo-European voice survived, where most older European voices disappeared, but it cannot bring back every lost sound or every earlier form of speech. Geography lights the floor beneath all of them. It shows why contact might have been slowed in some places, intensified in others, and shaped by mountains, coastlines, valleys, roads, and seasons. None of these lights fills the room completely. If we rely only on DNA, the Basque language becomes almost a side note, even though it is the reason the mystery exists. If we rely only on language, we may imagine an untouched people that the biological evidence does not support. If we rely only on archaeology, we may see objects and settlements without knowing which voices pass between them. If we rely only on geography, we may give the mountains too much power, as if stone itself could preserve a people without human choice, habit, and care. The origin of people is never held in one kind of evidence. It is held in the meeting of body, place, speech, work, and memory. A child born in any ancient community entered the world through biology, but also through a landscape already named by others. The child's body carried ancestors beyond memory. The child's first language came from voices close enough to repeat. The child's daily life was shaped by paths, food, weather, tools, animals, rules, and the small expectations of the household. That is where population history becomes human history. In the Western Pyrenees, those layers seem to have met in a rare balance. The people were not outside the movements that shaped Europe. Their ancestry belongs to the layered story of Western hunter-gatherers, early farmers, ancient Iberian populations, and later contacts. Their region was not closed to roads, empires, trade, faith, or neighbouring languages. Yet the Basque language remained outside the Indo-European family, living through contact rather than beyond it. Archaeology helps keep the story grounded, because it reminds us that languages and genes are carried by people who also make things, eat food, build shelters, tend animals, bury the dead, and adapt to material conditions. But archaeology also has humility built into it. A broken pot cannot tell us the language of the hand that used it. A burial can show care, status, or custom, but not the exact words spoken near it. A settlement can show continuity in place, but not the full inner life of the people who slept there. The same humility belongs to language and DNA. Each record is real, and each record is incomplete. When they are brought together, the Basque story becomes neither a myth of purity nor a dismissal of difference. It becomes a study in layered survival. It shows how a community can be biologically mixed, geographically rooted, historically pressured, archaeologically visible in fragments, and linguistically continuous in an unusual way. That is a more useful mystery than a simple claim of Europe's oldest people. It teaches us to ask what kind of oldness we mean. Old in the body, old in the tongue, old in the land, old in the habit of belonging. These forms of oldness can support one another, but they do not have to be identical. In the Basque case, their imperfect overlap creates the real question. Not who remained unchanged, but how enough continuity survived inside so much change, and what that survival can tell us about the fragile beginnings of all human communities. If the opening question returns now, it returns in a quieter form than before. The Basque DNA mystery is not asking whether one people stepped out of the deep past and remained untouched while Europe changed around them. That would be too simple and too hard for the evidence to support. It is asking something more careful. How can a community be changed by ancestry, farming, migration, empire, neighbouring languages, and ordinary human contact, while still carrying a voice that points toward a Europe before Indo-European dominance? In that question, the phrase, Europe's oldest people, becomes less like a claim and more like a problem to examine. Old in what sense? Old in the blood? That cannot mean pure descent, because the body records mixture across generations. Old in the language? That can be partly true. If we mean that Basque stands outside the Indo-European family and preserves a rare living link to the older linguistic diversity of Europe. Old in the land? That may also be partly true. If we mean that communities in the Western Pyrenees maintain strong ties to local valleys, mountains, coast, and social networks across long stretches of time, But none of these forms of age gives the whole answer. Each one is incomplete by itself. A person is not only DNA, a people is not only language, a homeland is not only a place on the map. Human identity forms where these things touch, separate, and touch again. The Basque case is valuable because those layers do not line up neatly. DNA says change, language says continuity, geography says shelter without total separation, history says pressure without complete replacement, archaeology says presence, movement, and material life, but often remains silent about speech. This unevenness is not a flaw in the story, it is the truth of the story. The human beginning has always been uneven. Every child begins again, with a body made from old ancestry and a mind shaped by present voices. The child does not know which ancient layer lives in the body. The child knows the hand that feeds, the sound that comforts, the name of the path, the warning near the slope, the familiar word spoken before sleep. If that word continues across generations, a line of speech survives. If marriages bring new ancestry into the same households, the body changes while the voice may remain. If public power brings another language into law, trade, religion, or school, the older language may shrink, borrow, adapt, or sometimes disappear. Basque did not disappear. That is not proof of an unchanged people. It is proof of a long and fragile transmission. It is a reminder that survival can be active, ordinary, and repeated. The people who carried Basque through time had to live with neighbours, not outside them. They had to pass through Rome, through Romance languages, through changing political worlds, through local and wider pressures. Their language changed as living languages must. Their ancestry changed as human ancestry does. Still, enough of the chain remained unbroken for one non-Indo-European voice to reach the present. This gives a more honest meaning to oldest. It does not mean closest to an original human state. It does not mean better, purer, or separate from the rest of Europe. It means that one living community preserves a rare overlap of old linguistic survival, regional continuity, and layered ancestry in a place where many older European voices were lost. The loss matters as much as the survival. Basque is not the full sound of pre-Indo-European Europe. It is one surviving echo beside a silence too large to recover. That silence holds vanished languages, forgotten household words, names for rivers no one speaks now, and generations whose descendants may still live while their voices are gone. So the question should remain open and respectful. What was preserved was not everything. What was lost was not nothing. Between those two truths, the Basque mystery becomes a way to think about every human origin, not as a fixed beginning, but as a fragile passage through time, where some inheritances vanish, some change, and some continue because people keep giving them to children. The value of the Basque story is not that it gives Europe a pure origin. It gives something more useful and more honest. It shows that human beings do not survive by remaining unchanged. They survive by carrying something fragile through change. A language can live for a very long time, but only if each generation makes it present again. A population can keep a regional shape, but only through real families, real marriages, real births, and real losses. A place can feel ancient, but only because people keep returning to it, naming it, working it, burying their dead near it, and teaching children how to move through it. The Basque case is therefore not a lesson about superiority or separation. It is a lesson about continuity without purity. It reminds us that the past is not preserved by refusing contact with the world. Much of the past survives by adapting to contact without losing every thread of itself. This is a gentle but important idea, especially when speaking about ancestry. DNA can make people imagine hard boundaries, but human history is usually made of soft edges. Families meet across valleys, new words enter old languages, outsiders become relatives, local people become strangers in another place. A child grows from biological inheritance, yet becomes a member of a community through care and speech. Nothing in that process is clean enough to support myths of untouched blood, but it is meaningful enough to support respect. The Basque language, standing outside the Indo-European family around it, gives listeners a way to understand how much of Europe's earlier soundscape has disappeared. It does not bring that whole soundscape back. It does not give names to every vanished language or voice, but it teaches the mind to imagine a continent before its present languages became dominant. It teaches that what seems normal now was once only one possible future among many. Spanish, French, English, German, and other Indo-European languages feel deeply rooted today, yet their dominance was the result of movement, power, transmission, and time. Before that dominance, other voices name the same rivers and mountains. Most are gone, Basque remained. That survival should make us careful, not triumphant. It should make us ask how easily human worlds can vanish when children stop receiving them. The origin of people is always renewed in children. This may be the most educational message hidden inside the mystery. A people is not only made by the dead, but by the living act of transmission. An elder speaks, a child listens, the child answers. In that small exchange, a line from the past either continues or weakens. The same is true beyond language. Knowledge of land, memory of migration, respect for local history, and awareness of shared humanity all depend on what one generation gives to the next. If what is passed on becomes false, exaggerated, or used to divide people, then the inheritance is damaged. If what is passed on is careful, humble, and open to evidence, then the past becomes useful without becoming a weapon. The Basque DNA mystery encourages that kind of humility. It does not ask us to believe that one people avoided the history that touched everyone else. It asks us to notice that history touches different places differently. Some regions are transformed quickly, some change more slowly, some lose their languages while keeping descendants, some keep a language while changing an ancestry, some remember a place while forgetting the older names beneath it. Basque stands as one example of how layered a human community can be. Its language points toward old Europe. Its DNA points toward mixture and regional continuity. Its geography points toward shelter and contact at the same time. Its history points toward pressure, adaptation, and endurance. The lesson is not that the oldest identity is the purest. The lesson is that identity is often a careful weaving of what remains and what has been changed. For a listener at night, this can become a quieter way to think about human life itself. Every person carries things they did not choose: genes, language, memories from family, habits from a place, losses from history, and names given before understanding. Yet every generation also changes what it receives. Nothing human is perfectly preserved. Nothing human is completely new. We live between inheritance and alteration. The Basque story gives that truth a landscape, a voice, and a long shadow across Europe. It says that survival is not the same as standing still. It says that oldness can be humble. It says that what lasts is often not what is hardest, but what can bend without breaking. At the end of the journey, the Basque mystery should not feel like a solved riddle placed neatly on a shelf. It should feel more like standing in a quiet valley after rain, hearing a living language move through the air while knowing that the ground beneath it has held many layers of human time. Somewhere behind the modern Basque story are older Western European communities, early farmers, ancient Iberian populations, later contacts, Roman roads, Romance neighbours, mountain households, coastal winds, and countless families whose names are gone. None of these layers alone explains the survival. None can be removed without making the story less true. The body carries ancestry, but ancestry does not speak by itself. The language carries continuity, but continuity does not mean that every older form has remained. The land carries memory, but land remembers only through people who keep naming it. Time carries loss, but loss is not always total. In this western corner of Europe, something remained audible after many surrounding voices disappeared. That does not make the people untouched. It makes the survival more delicate. It means that every generation had to receive a changed world and still pass forward enough of an older voice for the chain to continue. This is how human beginnings often live inside the present. They do not arrive as perfect fossils. They arrive as traces folded into ordinary life. A word spoken before sleep may carry a longer past than the speaker knows. A family name may rest on a landscape older than the story attached to it. A genetic pattern may hold fragments of forgotten migrations, while the person carrying it thinks only of home, work, hunger, kin, and weather. The Basque story teaches that the oldest things are not always the most rigid. Sometimes they are the most carefully renewed. A language can last because it changes enough to remain usable. A community can last because it receives newcomers without losing every local tie. A place can last in memory because children keep learning its names, even when the wider map is redrawn around them. This is not only a lesson about one region, it is a lesson about the human species. We are animals of inheritance, but not of perfect preservation. We carry bones shaped by evolution, genes shaped by ancient populations, minds shaped by social learning, and voices shaped by people who spoke before us. Every generation is born into a world it did not create, and every generation changes that world simply by living in it. That is why the Basque DNA mystery is valuable for sleep, for reflection, and for a slower kind of history. It does not ask us to fear the unknown or worship a hidden origin. It asks us to accept that the past is partly knowable and partly lost, and that honesty is more beautiful than certainty when the evidence is incomplete. Europe before the Indo-Europeans was not empty. It was filled with bodies, families, languages, and places. Most of those voices vanished. Not necessarily because their people vanished, but because the chain of speech broke somewhere between one generation and the next. Basque remains as one rare voice from that wider silence, changed by time, surrounded by other languages, carried by people whose ancestry is layered like all human ancestry. Its mystery is not the fantasy of a pure beginning. Its mystery is the endurance of transmission through a world that kept changing. It also reminds us that every surviving inheritance carries an unseen absence beside it, because what reaches us is always smaller than what once lived. As the night grows quieter, the question can stay open without needing to be solved. Between DNA and language, between mountain and sea, between what survived and what disappeared, the Basque story leaves us with one calm uncertainty. When a people carries an old voice through a changing body, what exactly has been preserved, and what has only learned how to continue?